Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to explore further how hate can actually shape decision making. In a previous episode called Priming, I explained how the actions, for example, of police can be shaped by how they are primed to view Indigenous nationals. And today I'm looking at the role that hate plays on both sides of the equation, if you will, in terms of Indigenous nationals and Canadians, and Canadian governments, I should say, purport to attempt to be trying to resolve, centuries-old issues. And why, quite frankly, I don't have a lot of hope that what is being proposed today is going to work. And that is because Canada is rife with systemic racism. I think that is something a court can take judicial note of at this point. And certainly Indigenous nationals are well aware, they live it daily wherever they go. And you have to remember, at the time that Canada came into being, the nations of Europe were entering on a mad scramble for empire, for colonial possessions overseas. The man in the street in England felt the manifest destiny of the Anglo-Saxon to rule the, quote, lesser breeds, end of quote. So that was the foundation of, and the belief system of people who came to the lands of the Indigenous nations and sought to, through their permissions, the Crown could exercise partial political sovereignty. In other words, begin to govern her people as they lawfully only use the lands that still remain owned by the Indigenous nations. So returning to this doctor of clinical psychology and behavioral medicine, explains that of all the emotions in the human repertoire, hate, anger, and resentment are among the most powerful and self-destructive. They are awakened in you by the actions of those you perceive to have hurt you or those you love. You may think that you want and are justified to hate or harbor rage against someone who has hurt you deeply enough to create these emotions. You may believe that they deserve it and are made to suffer by your hatred of them. You may sometimes treat your hatred as though it were a mythical curse on the target of your disdain. But to do so, to carry and feel that hatred, is to pay an unbelievably high price. For the reality is that those feelings change who you are. They change your heart and they change your mind. Hatred, anger, and resentment eat away at the heart and soul of the person who carries them. And there's assumption, it says to assume that you can turn your feelings on and off like a light switch is naive. I suspect you already know that it doesn't work that way. Bitterness and anger are such powerful influences that once they enter your heart, they are present in all your relationships. They truly do make you become a different person. Who you were goes away, and now you're defined by the hatred and bitterness. Ultimately, what makes these emotions so powerful is that they change who you are. They change what you do and contaminate what you have to give. And the concept is that you cannot give away what you do not have, which is exactly the problem Canada faces, because Canada cannot give away, and provinces by extension cannot give away what they do not have. There are no permissions to assign their rights under treaties to third parties, such as mining companies. This doctor says, think about that in its most literal sense. No matter how much you might like to, you can't give someone $1 million if you don't have it. Similarly, you cannot give pure and accepting love from a pure and accepting heart if you have neither. So it's about two parties then coming to a table, trying to negotiate, and both are harboring some level, some degree of hatred. How could Indigenous nationals not carry some reflection of what they were put through at residential school? How can they not carry some reflection of what is continued to be done to all their relations and their lands? I mean, I'm not saying it's not justifiable. It certainly is. What I'm trying to point out is that how you approach negotiations, your ability to see clearly, your ability to craft a good solution is affected when you're in that state. This is why for so many years I've emphasized that when you're bringing your circle together in order to resolve something, a lot of people look to me and say, well, tell us what to do. Now, I'll advise and I'll contribute to that circle, but I always say to start, you must be absolutely clear that you're coming at it from a good place. What that means is you're not bringing that distracting, life-changing, mind-affecting hatred, for example, and resentment into that circle. You're in there prepared personally to act from a place of core Indigenous laws, sharing, caring, loving. This is why their nations are so more advanced and were at time of contact from European settlers, because these are their core principles. That cannot be said for those who came over. They carry this concept of manifest destiny, that the doctrine of discovery, that these people, just because of how they look and how they live and what they believe, makes them not human. So how do you approach this? Because this is prevalent, and there's so much that's affected when a person sitting at the table across from the feds knowing how they're going to react because they've programmed that reaction and can trigger reactions. And that happens at the protest too. So many people don't realize the extent to which RCMP and infiltrators will actually attempt to provoke, and they know how to do it easily so as to turn something that's peaceful and lawful into something that Canada can apply its, for example, Anti-Terrorism Act to. So how to approach this? It's about being able to say, you cannot hurt me and then control me, even in your absence, by turning my heart cold and changing who I am and what I value. I am the one who makes those choices. You cannot choose for me how I feel, and I will not give you that power. Presently, Chief and Council, whether it's intentional or not, the fact is they are, through their lawyers, promoting certain pieces of it's not of passing of things. I don't know what to call it because it's not under Indigenous law, and it's not quite frankly, it's not lawful, whereby it purports to paper trail that Indigenous nationals individually have given up this right of choice, have handed it over to Chief and Council, or indeed just Chief, and that Chief in turn can hand it over to someone higher up in terms of a regional level, and ultimately to something like the AFN. So I'm going to repeat this, right? You cannot choose for me how I feel, and I will not give you that power. And that extends to all of your rights. And your rights are core, they're human rights. And they are the fact that this is your land, this is where you're born, and this is where your next generations have the right to live and be, and to live in a manner of their choice. So it's important that if you allow people who have transgressed against you to lock you into that role, they win. Understand that if you allow them to make you hate them, rage against them, and resent them, they win. Because after all, this is an attack on Indigenous governance. This is an attack on Indigenous law. And so when they can trigger you to act outside of those core values of loving, sharing, and caring, and this does not mean to say be weak. Be absolutely strong in your beliefs that this all still exists, that it is the law of the land. It is where the land is located. You have not capitulated, and no one can say, and you're under your law, you can't give away your responsibilities for your next generations. And that's all I have to say.